It's great to be here with you guys this morning. I feel especially blessed. I was running a little bit late this morning, and so I took the toll road, which I hate doing, especially on Sabbath, but in general, I just hate it. Like, it's one of my pet peeves, having to pay for roads. I'm sure some of you can relate. Taxes and toll roads are two of the great evils in the world that none of us enjoy paying. But I did it to try to be on time, and then as I was coming, I was going to pass this vehicle, and I looked, and I didn't see the car next to me. And so, wham! We side-swiped him. He was driving a truck. He started to swerve a little, but I was driving my car, which is nowhere near as big, so I started really swerving out of control. Was able to make it over to the median. Got out. There was nothing wrong on my car. I went across the road after waiting for a couple of cars to pass and went over and checked with them, and nothing was wrong with his car or with his truck, not even a scratch on either of our cars. So God was very good in protecting both of us. And so if I seem a little bit more nervous than normal, it's because I still a little bit of adrenaline from that. But I'm thankful to be here, and hopefully God provides similar protection and care for Annie. So we'll pray for her once again at the end of the service today. But I'm so thankful to be here with you guys, even more than I normally am because of that. I'm always thankful to be here with you guys. I love getting to come to church and worship with you guys. I was able to visit a couple weeks ago, and one of the weeks I wasn't preaching. Don keeps me pretty busy, moving me around preaching at his different churches, which I'm thankful for. But it's nice to be able to just come and worship with you without having to preach once in a while. And when I did, I brought my fiance Taylor with me, and she absolutely loved you guys. You guys were so friendly and welcoming to her, and so that meant a lot to me. And it's probably easier to be friendly and welcoming to her. She's a much nicer person to be around. But she said it reminded her of the first church she started going to when she first became an Adventist, and the church that helped her fall in love with this faith that we share. And so thank you so much for giving that gift to both of us. That means a lot to us. Today we're going to talk about something all of us face, tests of character. I want to just imagine a scenario. Most of you have probably been in this scenario at some point in your life. You show up to class Monday morning. You show up a few minutes early, you sit down, you start talking to your friend next to you about all the fun things you did that weekend. Where'd you go? Who'd you hang out with? And you talk about this and that and the other, and the one thing you don't talk about is how much you studied, because neither of you did study. And then all of a sudden, the bell rings and the teacher starts handing out pieces of paper. Pop quiz. That's how our characters are so often tested in life. It's very rare in life that we know when we'll be tested on our character, especially the big tests. We don't know how our character will be tested. We don't know exactly what's going to be on it or when. Life comes at us mostly as a series of pop quizzes. The question that most tests our character, it gets asked in a variety of ways, but the basic core of the question is the title of today's sermon, Bad News, What You Gonna Do? And so we're going to actually look at a story in the Bible where there's three characters that each get bad news, or at least what they perceive as bad news, and we're going to look at how each of them respond. So we're doing this as part of our series on the life of David, this guy who is a miniature picture of who the Messiah is going to be, pointing us forward to Jesus. But in this story, he's not actually the person who most points us towards Jesus, but it's someone else in the story. It's going to be a woman, not to spoil too much of the story for you, but that's what we're going to focus on, is this story about David and Nabal and Abigail, found in the book of 1 Samuel in chapter 25. So if you have your Bible either on your phone or you brought it on a hardcover copy, or maybe it's even in the pew in front of you. If you didn't remember to bring your Bible, that's fine. But if you want to follow along, I encourage you to. 1 Samuel chapter 25, starting in verse 1. Then Samuel died, and the Israelites gathered together and lamented for him, and buried him at his home in Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. This is actually one of two chapters in the book of 1 Samuel that begin by letting us know that Samuel died. So these two stories are actually kind of meant to parallel each other a little bit. There's this story, and then there's also the story of Saul going to the witch of Endor for advice. So in both stories, it's kind of how Saul and David contrast how each of them respond to this grief. And there's so many stories actually in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel that deal with this theme of grief and how do people respond in their grief. What kind of decisions do they make? How does it affect them? Both of David and Saul ultimately are going to have a woman that they turn to for wisdom that gives them advice, but it's very different types of advice. And so we're going to just want to point that little parallel out, and this is kind of the background. This is what David's going through in this story, is he's mourning the loss of his dear friend Samuel, who had anointed him king. And when David had first gone on the run from Saul, Samuel is the person who took him into his home and hid him for a while. So continuing verses 2 and 3, it says, "Now there was a man," and thank you, by the way, Nancy, for reading this for us. So verse 2 and 3, "Now there was a man in Moan whose business was in Carmel, and the man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel." This is sheep shearing season. This is a sheep shearing festival for them. Now, sheep shearing festival probably doesn't mean a lot to you guys. Maybe it does. But for most of us, this is not that big of a deal. Like, who cares that sheep shearing time? But it's a big deal. Sometimes when we read books or watch movies, certain settings just automatically give us a clue on what the story is going to be about. You see a movie or reading in a book about a dark house in the middle of the night in the woods, abandoned, far away from anyone, and you think immediately, oh, this is going to be a murder mystery. You have a story that takes place on a remote island in the Pacific, and you think this is either a story about pirates or this is a story about someone getting lost at sea and stranded on a deserted island. In the Bible, when there's sheep shearing festival, there's 4 stories about it in the Bible, and each time someone makes a dramatic move to get something that they have been denied that they feel they're owed. There's 2 stories in Genesis, and then there's 2 stories in Samuel, one here in 1 Samuel and one in 2 Samuel. Each time, someone has been denied something that they feel they have a right to, and in each case, they actually do have a right to it. And in each case, the person makes plans to do something very drastic to get what they feel they're owed. And so that's the setting for this story. And the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. Nabal's name means fool. Abigail's name means the father's joy. Both of them really live up to their names. So it matters what we name ourselves. It matters the identity we take on. And so both of these characters, they really live up to their name. It gives us a little flavor of what they're like. It says, "And she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. But the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb." Caleb comes from the tribe of Judah. So this is one of David's distant relatives. They're from the same tribe. They grew up in a similar part of the country. David is not all that far from the home he grew up in while he's around them. Continuing in verses 4 to 6, when David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall say to him who lives in prosperity, peace be to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have." David sends servants to ask Nabal. He's wanting to be included in this feast, which makes sense. This is a huge feast. Everyone in the area is supposed to be invited. That's just what's expected when you have one of these feasts. So David's getting ready to ask a very simple, a very expected request. And he starts by saying peace. Peace to you, peace to your family, peace to everything you own, your entire household. Peace, peace, peace. 3 times he mentions that this is a peaceful offer. That there's no threat behind it. There's no coercion or force. David is just very peacefully coming to Nabal. He continues with what his message is going to be for his servants to relay. He says, "Now I've heard that you have shearers, that's sheep shearing festival. Your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them all the time that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David." So David starts this request by saying, "Peace, peace, peace to you. Peace to your family, peace to everything you have." And then he describes how peaceful he's been to Nabal already. "We've been with you, and we're not some band of wild thugs who just take whatever we want. We have not only not stolen anything from you ourselves, even though we very easily could have, but we have protected you guys and made sure that no one else stole from you as well. We freely gave you this gift." And then he makes this request to be able to share in the banquet, to be able to share in this festival time, their version of Thanksgiving. And he tells the servants, "Tell yourself that you're Nabal's servants too, that you're here to serve him. And tell him that his son David is the one sending you." This may not mean as much to us as it did to their culture back then, but in a very patriarchal, hierarchical society, to say that you're someone's son, you're elevating that person above yourself. David is being extremely humble, extremely gentle in this request. He's elevating Nabal above himself, and he's just asking Nabal to do the thing that Nabal should have offered to do without even being requested, which is to share some of the feast with these guys who for over a year have lived and protected these guys without any sort of expectation of reward in return. So David sends his young men out. They go, they tell Nabal, and then they wait for the response. And finally, Nabal answers him in verse 10, if you want to keep following along. When Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse?" David didn't say he was the son of Jesse. Nabal knows exactly who David is because he knows who David's dad is. It's very clear. "There are many servants nowadays who break away, each one away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from?" Nabal hears this request and he responds by insulting. It's a very harsh insult. He's like, "Who are you? I've never heard of you." It's a lie. Everyone knows who David is. David's a fellow tribesman. He's from the same area. David was the guy who killed Goliath. He was the champion of Israel. He was a war hero. Everyone knew who David was. And yet he's pretends not to know who David is just to be insulting. "You're nobody. Why should I have heard of you?" He calls David a runaway slave, basically, which is also very insulting, and he refuses David's very simple request. Nabal is what we call nowadays a Karen, and I apologize. I know most of your names, but I don't know quite everyone's name here, so if your name's Karen, my apologies. But there's this stereotype right now of this woman, usually a middle-aged white woman, who's just very entitled. Every little thing that goes wrong, she immediately asks to see the manager. And if the manager can't fix it, then she asks to see the manager of the manager. And if that guy can't fix it, then she has to see his boss. And if the CEO can't fix it, she wants to talk to the owner. Just always very entitled. Any little thing that doesn't go her way, she demands to speak to the manager, demands that she get what she wants. And most people I've met are not like that. None of you have ever treated me like that or anyone else I've seen. You guys have been very much the opposite of this. But I just want to point out that that's the type of person Nabal is. He's this entitled, selfish person. He perceives this very peaceful, humble request to do something that Nabal was already obligated culturally to do as an insult to him. He perceives this very gentle, humble news that David would like to feast with you. David wants to come party with you. That's an insult to Nabal. It's just "Oh, I'll have to share some of my food with this guy? Are you serious?" He's a jerk. He's just the worst. But that's what happens when we allow ourselves to become entitled, when we expect from others all the time and never think, how can I serve back? When we just take everything good that people do for us for granted, and we just assume that that's what's expected, and they should have to do good things for us, they should have to go the extra mile for us, and we don't ever feel any obligation to do the same back for them, this is the type of person that we become. So hopefully none of us fall into that temptation. Hopefully we live our lives with a sense of gratitude, a sense of appreciation for what God has blessed us with, and a sense of, God's given me all these blessings. How can I turn around and share some of these blessings back with others? That's the mindset we should have, that if we don't want to be called a fool. So Nabal sends this message back. The servants turn around, they go back, they tell David all these words. And David responds in verse 13, after he hears Nabal's message. He says, every man gird on your sword. So every man girded on his sword. About 400 men went with David, and 200 men stayed back with the supplies. David is going to war. David is out for blood. A few verses later, it describes David's mindset, where David's talking about, he's swearing to himself that there will be no one left alive afterwards. I will kill every man in Nabal's household. How dare Nabal do this to me? This seems like a really big overreaction. Hopefully none of us have tried to kill someone when we ask them for food and they're like, no. But in their culture, this is not an overreaction. David, you have to remember the spot he's in his life. He's been on the run for over 10 years of his life straight. Hunted like a wild animal. He's in mourning over the loss of Samuel. So there's these emotional reasons why he's not being as gracious and thoughtful towards Nabal as he was in the previous chapter with Saul, when he had a chance to take Saul's life and kill him. Or the next chapter, actually, after this, he has another chance to kill Saul. He also refuses to kill Saul. So David is normally very gracious towards his enemies, and this time he's not. He's out for blood. He is not going to take this insult. But this is an overreaction to us because we're so ingrained in a culture that's been, even if it's no longer a fully Christian culture, there's still a lot of leftover values from Christianity of generosity and compassion. But that's not the world that these guys are living in. They're living in a world of kings, of hierarchy, of you take what you want by force very often. But David, as a fellow tribesman of Nabal, had treated him well. David was this champion of Israel, one of the greatest war heroes that Israel had ever known. And even more than that, David had been anointed the king. When Israel had asked Samuel for a king, they said they wanted a king like the other nations. And David is reacting the way a king from the other nations would react when they're insulted this way by someone who's doesn't even have an official political office. To say something like that to the guy who's king or that's anointed to be the next king, that's a sentence worthy of death, to be that insulting to someone in David's position. And so David is not really overreacting. David's just reacting. David is doing the thing that's expected. We kind of expect in our own lives when someone really wrongs us deeply, when someone is extremely insulting, when someone calls us horrible, derogatory names, when someone puts us down, when someone hurts us significantly financially or physically or emotionally, we expect that we should be able to react and pay them back in kind. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. We kind of have this idea sometimes. And so David is responding in a predictable way. But luckily, that's not the end of the story, because Nabal's servants see the look in David's servants' eyes as they leave, and they know, this is not going to go well. So they go and they come to Abigail, and it says, they tell her that you're a woman of good understanding. Do what is in your understanding. These men have been good to us. They've protected us. And they trust that Abigail will know what to do. They know that she is wise. She's earned that reputation and how she's reacted and dealt with stuff her whole life. She didn't know that this pop quiz on her character was going to be tested today, but she's ready for it because her whole life has been spent learning how to be wise, learning how to have her heart in tune to the leading of God's Holy Spirit in her life. And so Abigail responds by preparing an obscene amount of food. It describes that she brings 200 loaves of bread, 5 fully cooked, ready-to-eat sheep. And I looked up how much meat is on a typical sheep. It's about 50 pounds of meat. So it's 250 pounds of fully cooked, barbecued lamb that she's bringing. She also brings 200 cakes of one type of fruit, another 100 cakes of another type of thing, and 60 pounds of just extra wheat just to go along with it. It's a huge amount of food. And she saddles it on her donkeys. She has her servants quickly get it ready and has them go ahead bringing this gift of food to David. But she doesn't tell Nabal. Now, I don't want to advocate that you don't tell your significant other when you do something big like this. Generally, that's a very bad idea. But in this case, it's wise because Nabal has already had a chance to react to David, and he responded very poorly, and now she's fixing it. She's a wise woman. She knows when to say something and when to just do the right thing and not worry about telling anyone. So then she comes to David, and I just want to slow down a little bit and just read this speech that she gives David. This is one of the most beautiful speeches given in the entire Bible. In the entire history of the world, this is one of the most gracious, humble speeches. If you ever have to confront someone who's about to do something, who's about to make a terrible decision that's not reversible, that's going to affect them and the people around them for the rest of their lives, this is an amazing handful of verses, an amazing speech to go back and look at how does Abigail address David, who's about to do something very harsh that's not able to be undone once he does it. You can't unkill a person. You can't unslaughter a family. And so how does she go about this conversation? She goes to David, it says in verse 23, she dismounts quickly from the donkey, fell on her face before David, and bowed down to the ground. So she fell at his feet and said, she's humble. She's bowing down to him. She's a rich woman who's married to Nabal. Nabal responds with scorn, treats David like he's way beneath him. Not just like David's a servant, but that David is a runaway servant. So you're not even good at being a servant, David. You're the worst. But she flips the script. She acts as if she's David's servant, as if she's here to serve him, not demand that he serve her. It's a very different approach. It's a very humble, gracious approach. It's the right approach in a situation like this. And then she gives this speech, and we'll just read it in its total, and then we'll go back and break it down a little bit. But I just want you to get a feel for the flow of the speech here, starting verse 24 through verse 31. So she fell at his feet and said, "On me, my Lord, on me let this iniquity be. And please let your maidservant speak in your ears and hear the words of your maidservant. Please do not let my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly goes with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young man of my Lord whom you sent. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord, the divine name of God, lives, and as your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek for my Lord be like Nabal. And now, this present which your maidservant has brought to my Lord, let it be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord. And evil is not found in you throughout your days. Yet a man has risen to pursue you and seek your life, but the life of my Lord shall be bound together in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the pocket of a sling. And it shall come to pass when the Lord has done for my Lord according to all the good, and he has spoken concerning you, and has anointed you ruler over Israel, that this will be not grief for you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord has avenged himself, but when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. This is such a beautiful speech. Abigail's response to bad news is to do good to the person who's about to do terrible harm to her and her family. This is gracious. This is love. This is what Jesus is talking about when he says, love your enemies. Abigail goes and she advocates on behalf of Nabal, her foolish, harsh jerk of a husband, and says, don't blame him. Put the blame on me. I'm the one at fault here. She's not the one at fault at all. She hasn't done anything wrong. She didn't even know about the request, David's servants being terrored, until they'd already left. But yet she takes the blame on herself the way Jesus, who did nothing wrong, takes our blame on himself. She does call Nabal a fool. But wow, she could have gone so much more into detail about what a terrible person he was. Even in that, she's still being gracious with that. She still says, blame me. And how she talks about herself and how she talks about David is just incredibly humble. She doesn't ever refer to herself by her own name, or that she never mentions that she's the rich wife of this landowner, that she's this rich lady in her own right. But instead, she calls herself your maidservant every time she mentions herself. I'm your maidservant, your maidservant, your maidservant. 6 times she says that to David. 14 times in this conversation, she refers to David as my Lord. She never calls David by his name or any other title or anything else in this conversation. She only refers to him as my Lord. She is elevating David above herself. She is being very humble, very gracious, and she's elevating this person who's about to do something very bad to her and her family. This is just an incredible way to, if you want to bring out the best in someone, talk to them and treat them as if the best in them is already happening. And 7 times in this conversation, she talks about the Lord. And each time it's to remind David of what he has already done or what he will do in the future for David. It's a very humble speech. It's a very speech that's elevating David, that's reminding him that the Lord ultimately is the one in charge. And there's 5 key ways I want to point out of how she really appeals to the best part of David's character. She never shames David for what he's about to do. She never says, oh, you're overreacting, you're harsh, nothing like that. But she only appeals to the good in him. She starts by saying that the Lord has already kept David from avenging himself. This seems a little bit odd because David's on his way to avenge himself. But she assumes that David will respond well to her request, saying that God has already kept you from doing this, David. Then she says that David fights the Lord's battles. She's like, yeah, I know who you are. You're the champion of Israel. You're the guy who killed Goliath. You're the guy who won victories for our people over and over again. You fight for the Lord. And this is a subtle way of pointing out that this isn't fighting for the Lord. This is fighting for yourself, David. This isn't what you're about. She says that no evil is found in him. And at that moment, there was a lot of evil to be found in David's heart. But she ignores all of that. She's like, there's no evil in you. Like, you want to do the good thing. You're a man after God's own heart is what she's hinting at. And then she says that God will sling away the lives of David's enemies. This brings David back immediately. When was the last time in the story that he used a sling? Goliath. She's like, yeah, Nabal says he has no idea who you are, I know exactly who you are. You're the champion who killed Goliath. And don't you remember back then how you totally relied on God to fight your battles on your behalf? And David just immediately is taken back to that moment of complete trust in God, where he wasn't he wasn't doing things on behalf of himself, but on behalf of God and of others. And then she says, when you become king, she's like, I know you're anointed to be the next king. You will have no grief over shedding innocent blood. You're not going to have any guilty conscience over shedding innocent blood, David, because that's not who you are. You're not the type of king who sheds innocent blood over petty insults and misunderstandings. You're better than that. It's incredible how much she just appeals to the best of who he is, to his potential as a person. And so often we forget to do that in how we address people when they are starting to go in the wrong direction with their life. But how much better if we appealed to the best of who people are, elevating them above ourselves when we do have those chances to have those difficult conversations with people, trying to point them back in the right direction in their life. Abigail ultimately is a Messiah figure in this story. She is someone who's pointing us towards the ultimate Messiah, the person who's going to be the ultimate person who makes all things right. She sets aside her pride and ego, completely humbling herself. She risks her life on behalf of others. She goes and humbly advocates for her foolish husband and for the innocent people in the household that would have been slaughtered along with him. And she places all the blame of Nabal on herself. This is exactly what Jesus, the ultimate Messiah, did for each of us. He sets aside all of his position in heaven, all of the riches and glory that came with who he naturally was, all the things that were owed to him, he sets aside in order to come and take our blame on himself, in order to advocate for us, in order to save our lives. Abigail risks her life. Jesus ultimately just gives his life away for us. It's so beautiful, this comparison between Abigail and Jesus. David responds well. His heart has been completely melted. He's reminded that I am a man after God's own heart. This is not the type of king I want to be. This is not the type of man God's called me to be. So he starts by blessing the Lord. Then he blesses her advice. And then finally he blesses Abigail herself. He accepts her gifts, tells her to go in peace. The next day, Abigail tells Nabal what she did. He has a heart attack, and 10 days later he dies, and the Bible mentions that this is God's punishment on Nabal. David didn't have to avenge himself. God was going to take care of David. God was going to be the one that righted the wrong against David. David recognizes, wow, there is something special about this woman. It's not just her physical beauty, but it's much more the wisdom of this woman and how in tune she is with the leading of God in her life and how good she is at helping me to see how God's leading, how humble and gracious she is and how she approaches me when I've made mistakes. And David proposes to her. Abigail quickly says yes, and with her trademark humility, calls herself a servant to wash the feet of David's servants. She's like, I'm here to serve even your servants, David. I am all about serving others. And this is another way where she just reminds us of who Jesus is. In the kingdom of God, whoever wants to be the greatest has to be the person who is willing to serve others the most. That's how greatness is measured in the kingdom of God. And that's why Abigail is one of the greatest characters in the Bible, because of her extreme humility and desire to serve everyone. So in your life, how do you respond to bad news? Bad news, bad news. What you going to do when it comes for you, to kind of paraphrase that old song from the 90s? Or at least what are you going to do with whether it's actual bad news or things that you just perceive as bad news? Nabal was so entitled that he perceives a very small request that he was already obligated to do as bad news. And he responds to what should have been good news, this good thing that David did. He repays evil for the good that David has done to him. He's maniacal. He's a maniac. None of us want to be like him. And as far as I can tell in my interactions with you, none of you are like him. Praise God. David, in this moment of grief and worn down by years on the run, responds to the bad news of being insulted so callously and rudely by coming to put Nabal in his place. David plans to repay evil with evil. This is predictable. Some of us do fall into that sometimes. I know I do. That's very often my first gut instinct is to just like someone does something bad to me, I need to put them in their place. I need to let them know this is not okay. I'm not going to stand for it. I'm going to get you back. And if you're honest with yourself, some of you have that as your natural reaction as well sometimes. It's predictable. But are we called to be predictable? Or is there something more in our lives? Abigail, who is wise and in tune with the Spirit of God, responds to bad news by humbly advocating on behalf of others and by bringing generous gifts to the person who's about to kill her and her family. She repays good for the evil that's about to be done for her. This is remarkable. This is the call of us as Christians. If we want to follow God, this is the way that we will respond to bad news in our lives. So bad news, what are you going to do when it comes for you? I just want to end on this thought. There's this guy named Andy Stanley. He's a famous preacher, a Christian preacher here in America. He has this question he asks if you want to be wise in your life. He says, what story do you want to tell when this moment is nothing but a story that you tell? All the moments in our life that we go through at some point are all in the past, and all it is a story we tell, or a story that others tell about us. Do we want our story to be one about arrogance and pride, or about being needlessly harsh, that we never took any crap from anybody, that we always paid everyone back exactly what they deserve to be paid back? Are we going to make our story about we took what we wanted no matter the cost to ourselves or others, even if it costs us our own integrity? Or do we want our story to be of a person who lives by God's wisdom, humble and gracious in the face of challenges, a story of someone with integrity even when it costs us, a story of someone who loved even our own enemies? Do we want our story to be about how we followed the Spirit of God and allowed us to bless others no matter what happened in our lives? What's the story that you want to tell when this moment of your life is nothing but a story that's told?